What is up? Welcome, everyone, all aboard the Hype Train podcast. I am, as always, not Joe Wheat. I am Hunter Miller, stepping in to take his place as, I guess, the host. Does that mean this is my podcast for the week?
You've stepped out from behind the barcode, Hunter.
We will debate on this episode. Joined by Chandler Miller and, of course, Trevor Levitt. Gentlemen, how are you? How was the it was our own mini bye week of sorts last week. I think we were all a little too depressed, and B, it was the holiday Thanksgiving week that we just didn't record an episode. But how was your Thanksgiving and how was your week off?
I had to take the sadness I was feeling and replace it with key lime pie. That was the only way to fix it. That's the only remedy that works after a devastating loss like that.
Yeah, I went to work today and was working in office. Sometimes I work from home, but it occurred to me that I hadn't signed up for some of our I guess department Christmas party stuff because I had anticipated being in Dallas, and so it just kind of hit me throughout the day, I was going to be at home and excited to go to the stadium, 2 days from now, and yeah, it kind of hit a little bit different today. So it's been tough, but yeah, still a lot to be excited about.
If you're gonna sell your tickets, make sure you sell them to someone wearing Iowa State gear, right? Isn't that the old Arizona State rule? What I guess is your most normal Thanksgiving tradition that you guys do, and then what's like the most obscure, different Thanksgiving tradition? Trevor mentioned what made me think about it was Trevor mentioned key lime pie, and I thought I've never heard key lime pie being like the go-to Thanksgiving dessert.
Hey, that's like my family though, is like kind of the tart, like the cheesecake, that type of deal. And so I guess that does make us a little peculiar. My dad grew up in California, so like the citrus has always been a big part of the family. But as far as
that's like 75-degree Thanksgiving is like busting out with key lime pie.
Yeah, there we go. But as far as like regular traditions, I guess maybe not regular for us, but one that we're looking to make regular is for the first time in a long time, we did a turkey bowl. So
there you go.
That was fun. We enjoyed that a lot.
Nice. Chandler?
Yeah, I would say the turkey bowl is probably my favorite like overall holiday tradition. Like it's just an excuse for people to go out and play some pickup football. This year it actually happened to be pickup soccer, so it's a little bit of a twist there, but that's kind of all I could find. Yeah, football. It's all I could find within like a 20-mile radius where I lived. I got some invites for games like way far away, but
the Pilgrims are rolling in their graves knowing that you're playing a European game on their Thanksgiving holiday.
This is what they were getting away from, Chandler.
They'd be shocked at the horrors of today, I'm sure. But yeah, there's that, and then my aunt made a delicious like apple pie, but everything like fresh, like that, hard to beat. So apple pie with some good like vanilla ice cream on there, melting into it. Same thing with peach cobbler, like just get some melted ice cream in there. Yeah, unreal.
See, I'm not a Thanksgiving food guy. Like turkey is whatever, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, stuffing. Like it's very like if I could concoct the most medium mid meal of all time, like that would be essentially the Thanksgiving spread. So I guess not growing up, but like throughout high school and then the last few years, the tradition has always been to go to St. George, and then to just go to Chuck-a-Rama.
There you go.
With my family.
Okay.
However, unfortunately, my parents sold their St. George house, so there was no St. George Thanksgiving this year. So instead, we went to my wife's parents' house, and fortunately, they also are not a big like traditional Thanksgiving family. Mm-hmm. So we did steak and crab legs as like Thanksgiving food. Which, like, if you're gonna spend like a crazy amount of money on like these Thanksgiving foods, like why cook a terrible turkey when you could just like steam some crab legs and grill some steak? Like that's the way to do it. So that big fan. New Thanksgiving tradition. Honestly, I don't think I have a normal Thanksgiving tradition. I've had a very like abnormal Thanksgiving holiday. I guess the biggest one for me is just like I watch the Detroit Lions and all the other NFL football games. So
my new tradition is going to be crashing Hunter Miller's parties.
Even the years that I'm not at the in-laws, Trevor will show up to Draper and be like, "Hey, Remember me. I'm back for some more crab legs. Jameis Winston style.
Yeah.
But, of course, Thanksgiving traditions, good food, everything like that. And then BYU football. A little bit of a rivalry with the last 2 times BYU's played Houston. Had some bad blood between the spitting incident in 2020 and then a little raucous. What would you call? What would be the accurate word to describe whatever Darius Laster found himself in after a garbage time touchdown?
A skirmish,
a schism,
a skirmish, a scuffle,
a ruffling of feathers.
Whatever it was, like BYU and Houston apparently just like don't like each other, and there's always a little something. So it made sense for rivalry weekend. I mean, there were fights all across the board, along college football all day Saturday, but kind of we won't spend a lot of time on it just because it was a game BYU should have won, a game BYU did win. But kind of what was, Trevor, you were there. I don't know, Chandler, were you at the game?
Yeah.
So you guys were both there, but like talk about kind of your takeaways, what the energy was like, because it seemed from texts that maybe LaVell Edwards Stadium realized that this game was ended up going to be meaningless there at the end with Iowa State beating Kansas State. But talk to me about the game.
Yeah, it was. You alluded to it quite well. The energy, like initially, was good. I think there was a lot of anticipation, both from the team and the fans. And especially at the time, I'm trying to remember. I think Kansas State had just scored right at kickoff, so the score was like 21-24. Can you tell I watched the game from my phone on the in the stands? So it was close. Like I think we were feeling pretty good about things. You kind of had that freak awesome touchdown from Talon Alfrey, like with the kickoff and everything. Like that was fun. And then right around like I guess the front, like or the halfway point of the second quarter, Iowa State was very clearly going to win. And I know for myself, like I tried really hard to not let it affect like how I was cheering, but it was really hard. And what happened next, like once halftime took place and what we saw after, it was very clear that the team found out too. Like that was kind of something that I was wondering about, like before the game I was like, could Kalani like put a phone ban on the team? Like, is that something you can do with like college age kids? Like probably not. And they came out and it was very clear. Like it was very clear that the fans knew the score, that the players knew the score, and just like what everything that like transpired after that was just, it was a kind of a tough watch. Like you have Jack Kelly who records his first interception of the season, and we talked about it. Even we were texting back and forth during the game, and like at that moment in the game, if BYU had a chance to go to the conference championship game, like that stadium is going crazy. But instead,
Kansas State won,
yeah, like had all of that fallen into place, then everyone's high-fiving, like we're well on our way. But instead, you kind of get this like half-hearted, like LaVell Edwards, like woohoo, and that's that, and like I think that for me is what broke my heart a little bit. If you watch the cut, they obviously don't take much from the halftime speech, but the part that they do talk about, like it's Kalani's like, yeah, like let's go out there and win it for the seniors and send them out on a good note. And you can tell that how disappointed he was too. And so
I mean, he's scraping the bottom of the barrel for like excuses of like, let's go out there and win this second half.
Yeah. And so good on him for finishing the game and winning and getting to that 10-win season, which is, obviously not an easy task, but it was very clear that everyone involved in that stadium, as far as like BYU athletics goes, like the energy dropped a lot.
Yeah. I like many as well, was also watching the Kansas State Iowa State game on my phone, and my phone for whatever reason seemed to be like 20 seconds ahead of a lot of people around me. And so there was a distinct moment I don't think I'll ever forget, but I was looking down at my phone, and that was the crazy play where Avery Johnson had run like 20 or 30 yards backwards into his own end zone and then had thrown the ball away for what ended up being a safety because of intentional grounding. And I was like, oh my gosh, I felt the weight of like, this almost definitely means a Kansas State loss, which means, so it felt horrible watching that on my phone. And then I look up and then one of the Houston defensive tackles has the ball lumbering down the sideline. It was terrible timing. I'd missed like the weird fumble on I think it's supposed to be an end around or something like that. And it was just a very depressing moment where just everything was kind of hitting in tandem of like, it looks like this game isn't going to mean as much. And then we were texting throughout the game, like, are we even going to win this game? How we were playing the first little bit. And luckily BYU did just enough. Right. But it was a very somber kind of a sad environment to have everyone's hopes dashed even just within like a 30 minutes from kickoff. So I felt the same kind of lack of energy, and it was definitely noticeable in the second half.
Like my attitude, like it's just so funny because like that first half, like outside of like I looked up to see the Talon Alfrey touchdown. Like it wasn't,
which you saw more there than the ESPN viewers at home.
Yeah,
saw.
that's fair. That's fair. Like all of a sudden, the stadium erupts, and I literally go, "What's going on?" And here comes Talon Alfrey. Like it really was kind of a surreal feeling because I'm like you guys know this. Like we started this podcast over this, but we're all huge BYU fans. Like I don't miss a second
breaking news
of the game, but like. I'm literally watching and it's almost like, can you guys just like wait a second? Like none of this matters until this like wraps up. Like, can you guys like just stop? Can we get all these, 5-minute TV timeouts and wrap this game up first? But it just, it was just such a bummer. Like one of those things where you just know BYU's like a football dinging off of a player's helmet away, or even like I won't use a name, but like a DB just falling on said football after it hit one of his teammates in the like face. Like,
or you could say the name. It's an actual play that happened.
I know, but like
it's not his fault.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to imply.
BYU is a Jacob Robinson falling on the ball or a Jake Retzloff not overthrowing JoJo Phillips.
Or like
Arizona State.
Maybe that's better. We throw out everything that like Connor Pay not false starting on that play where we've Chase Roberts was going to be open in the end zone against Kansas, but
on that same note, you could say like BYU is also like a Darius Lassiter breaking tackle away from losing to Iowa State. They're a missed field goal away from losing to Utah, a holding call away from losing. Like there's a lot of obviously plays that go both ways, but as a fan, it's hard not to be like, man, if that punt doesn't perfectly bounce off of, I think it was Evan Johnson's helmet, BYU probably beats Kansas. Their committee's not going to, they'd be in the championship anyway, but like even then, BYU is probably, with the way that college football has unfolded over the last few weeks, even with one loss going into the championship game, that one loss being a 6-point road loss to Arizona State, who's in the championship game as well. Like BYU is probably firmly in the playoff, maybe win or lose the Big 12 championship, right? Like a one-loss team. It's hard to say because the committee is such friggin' dimwits when it comes to evaluating SEC teams versus everyone else. But you'd like to think that BYU beats Kansas, win or lose the Big 12 championship game, you're probably in the playoff, right? Yeah. Like it comes down to a 2-loss BYU that lost in the conference championship versus a 3-loss Ole Miss, South Carolina, or Alabama that aren't in the conference championships. It's the same kind of line of thinking I have when it comes to SMU playing Clemson in the ACC championship, where it's like, if Clemson beats SMU, I probably put SMU in over those other teams like Alabama and Ole Miss. I think you would be having the same conversation against BYU. But it's, like I said, you make that point for BYU's that close to being undefeated. BYU's also that close to maybe having 4 or 5 losses, right? So that's just the nature of football. The intern tweeted out that like never been more sad after a BYU go-ahead touchdown than they were in that like first or second quarter against Houston. Absolutely true. And you guys both spoke to it with the energy in the stadium, where it's like Kansas State loses, BYU then scores a touchdown to go up on Houston, and it's kind of just like, okay, cool, like whatever, right? I've never seen probably a more deflated fan base after a score in a close game than I did in that moment. But I guess how does the fact that BYU is not going to be in the conference championship change your outlook just on the season as a whole? How would you describe the season? Because we talk a lot about, before this year, we were all kind of down on the football team. I think everyone said make a bowl game, and that's a huge victory. The fact that BYU was in the Big 12 championship race until 10 p.m. Mountain Time on a Saturday Thanksgiving weekend is pretty incredible. But as we know, expectations change as the season goes along. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to say like, yeah, the expectation was 5 wins and BYU doubled that. And that's great. I mean, it is great. But we shouldn't necessarily view the season in the same lens that we did before the season started. But I guess I'll defer to you guys. How does the fact that BYU ended up losing 2 of their last 3 games and missing out on the conference championship change how you view the year as a whole?
Yeah, so I'm going to double down, or at least recall what I said after the Utah game, which is that regardless of how the season ends, I'm always going to look back fondly on this team like forever. And that is the case. I do have to laugh just a little bit at how different like this podcast episode would be if those 2 losses took place at the forefront of the season. Like say BYU drops one to SMU, loses to Kansas State, and then wins out the rest of the way and finishes the year 10-2. Like we'll say they still don't make the championship. Like obviously the way things worked out, like BYU maybe makes the championship under that scenario.
Well, they definitely do.
They would. Yeah. 1 loss. Yeah.
But let's say they don't.
Let's say Iowa State ends up going undefeated, and
like we're all talking about this season a lot differently. But the problem is they started off 9-0 and then they tripped at the finish line. And like that is the part of it for me that stinks about the situation. Like even with like the college football playoff committee, like with what we've seen with like Notre Dame and everything, like BYU might actually be in at large, like at this point of the season, given everything that we've witnessed up to this point. But it's just a bummer that you were talking about, and I'm not going to say any of this to try and sound like bitter or whatever, but Hunter, you brought up like traditions earlier today. The end of the season kind of felt like traditional BYU in a sense, where like they have these games that they're not supposed to win. They start off on this hot streak, and then like eventually along the way the wheels come off. And like, frankly, I'm just kind of tired. I'm really grateful for this season, and I like none of it's going to change my fandom. I'm going to be like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed for the season opener. I'm going to look at every recruit that we get as like the next great. But like, I'm tired. Like, can we just like finish the job? You know what I mean? Like after we beat Utah, I'm like, it's over. You got the monkey off your back. You beat Utah for the first time in Rice Eccles Stadium since 2006. And like the rest of the way, like, yeah, Kansas looks a little bit better. Arizona State looks a lot better. And then you beat Houston, but like they're going to find a way to figure it out.
And even the Kansas one, like Kansas looked good, but you're also like, it's a night game at Lavelle Edwards Stadium.
Yes, exactly. Like there's reasons to be confident outside of like even just the record. It's like, well, based off of what BYU has shown me up to this point, we should be able to win this game. And mind you, they had a chance, but the problem is they didn't. And just like 2020, like all the ducks are in a row, and then you stumble against Coastal Carolina, and all of a sudden, like everything that you've been aspiring to up to this point, like it doesn't mean anything anymore. Like you at the time validate what the College Football Playoff Committee was worried about with the 2020 team in the schedule by losing to Coastal Carolina, and they don't even talk about you the rest of the season. And it's just like one of those things where it's like, I hope the players have seen, like, first of all, I hope the players look back on this season, especially the seniors, and understand that what they did this season was special. Like, that's not something I'm taking away from them at all. But the players that are still here, like, I hope that you guys are tired too. Like, I hope they're tired of doing great things, but coming up short. 2021 did the same thing, like started off 6-0, lost to Boise, lost to Baylor. Like, it's eventually you have got to get over that hump. And I I thought it was going to be this season, and it wasn't. And like, we'll love this team forever, but man, like, I'm tired. I think that's like the conclusion that I've come to, is like happy but exhausted. You know what I'm saying? Like it's
like, I think for me, and Joe mentioned this too in our text, and I'm not putting him on blast because he's not here, because I feel the same way, where it's like I just am like almost like so mentally and emotionally exhausted. And not even in the same sense that you're talking about, Trevor, where it's like year after year, BYU gets so close and ultimately something happens towards the end that messes it up. But more so just the fact of every single game, I was like emotionally building myself up, right? Like Sunday through Friday was like, all right, we've got to win the Saturday. If we win the Saturday, then it's next week, and they're on the road, but they should be able to beat that. And you're just like going through every situation, every possible outcome in your head, each and every single week, of how BYU can get to the conference championship, how BYU can get to the playoff, and not only for BYU games, but like I was watching the Utah-Iowa State game, rooting for Utah, disgusting, in almost the same way that I root for BYU. And I was rooting, and I was watching Iowa State,
Kansas State too.
And I was absolutely rooting for Kansas State in the same way that I root for BYU. And it's like I'm going through the same experience multiple times every single Saturday, and in the week, leading up to every single game. The same weekend where BYU loses to Arizona State, it was like a 1:30 game, ends at 5, and then at like 6 o'clock, Iowa State Utah starts, and people go through, here's what needs to happen for BYU to still make the conference championship game, and you realize Iowa State needs to lose, and then you turn on that game and you watch Utah fall apart in the end, give up a touchdown drive, and then go down and try to kick a field goal to tie the game and miss the field goal badly, and you're like, okay, well, now I've just relived the entire emotional experience that I did at 1:30 this afternoon again. And like, how many times can I do this? It's almost like 2 or 3 seasons compiled into one, where I'm just like so mentally just like drained of like, I need to take it just a step back. And I think Joe's doing that right now. He's in freaking the Bahamas or something. But like even last week, Joe's like, we can't. And this isn't why we didn't do the podcast, but even Joe, immediately after the BYU lost Arizona State, he's like, we might have to skip this week's episode.
Yeah.
Ultimately, again, for the record, was not the reason why we skipped the episode. It was purely for Thanksgiving. Joe was traveling. People had family stuff. But I think it was just like, I can't like record another hour and a half podcast and talk about this football team after having gone through the last 8 hours of essentially this roller coaster of emotions. But yeah, I mean, Chandler, what are your thoughts? Obviously, before the year, I think, again, 5-7, and now here we sit 10-2. But what was, I guess, how you view the year as a whole?
Yeah, I think, like, to answer the original question, it has to change your outlook on the year. The fact that we stumbled so close to the finish line, like having every reason to beat Kansas at home, like in a night game in LaVell Edwards Stadium, like just falling so short in like a comedy of errors and so many potential culprits, So I think that has to kind of affect your overview of the year, while still remembering that this was a rather incredible year and we defied a lot of odds. Like I had this conversation with my buddy Tanner, who I have season tickets with, but we were like debating getting season tickets. That's kind of how our overview of the upcoming season was.
Do I waste money on this year, or?
And we got like, I'm sure everybody who had home like season tickets will tell you, like, this was the most incredible home slate of games in a long time. Like we had the opener, which Southern Illinois, like whatever, that was good. But then, I
mean, that was like a fun game, because you were kind of like, oh, okay, like maybe Jake has things figured out, and the running game looks good. LJ looks good.
Yeah, it was a fun game, like kind of typical opener of the season against like a inferior opponent. And then going to Kansas State, I'm like, all right, we're 3-0, but like good chance the Magic stops here. And the Magic like started there. Yeah, like, oh boy. And so like that was really when it kind of kicked off, like, oh, we might be legit. Like, instead of beating SMU, Wyoming, and we didn't know how good those teams were going to be. Like, if you would have told me at the start of the year that SMU was going to be a top 8-9 team, probable conference champion. And then like being in Arizona with big noon kickoff at home, like super fun. Gus Johnson on the call, the miracle against Oklahoma State, the last second, and then beating Utah. Like that was an away game, but just really an exhausting season, like Trevor said, like super fun to cover and to watch. A lot of emotional investment, like Hunter said, just thinking of all the different scenarios in which BYU would make the conference championship game. I was like pricing out tickets. A lot of fans were, and now subsequently, sadly, selling those tickets. But it is pretty remarkable that at the start of the season, we were, on the verge of like, will we make a bowl game, to now and we'll get into our bowl game predictions later, but now it's kind of like, if we aren't playing another top 15, 18 team in the country in a nationally televised bowl, it's an insult, and rightfully so. And you have national writers on Twitter saying, hey, like, here's a blind resume of this team on Twitter. Do you think they deserve to be in the college football playoffs? And then like 70-80% of the responses are like, oh yeah, that team should be in. And then the response is like, well, would that surprise you to hear that it's BYU actually who's kind of, getting shafted by the committee? Like, it's just kind of how it is. So honestly, I think it's kind of like the best term would be like, I think it's broadening our horizons for the future of BYU football, where this is kind of expected to be a kind of rebuilding year. BYU wasn't quite feeling the same way, and they're like, hey, like, let's show everybody what we can do. And that's got to be helpful with recruiting. And I think we had a good recruiting class. Like, I think the transfer portal is probably going to give to us more than it takes from us, hopefully. Like, there's a lot of cool, and then going into next year, right, with hopefully another fun slate of home games. We get one of Colorado, we get Utah again. Like, there's a lot of optimism going into next year as well, because
a favorable schedule.
That. Yeah. Should be a really fun, another exciting year. And this year, I imagine expectations will be higher, which is a gift and a curse, but like, really exciting.
It's interesting. And I don't want to dwell on it a ton right now, just because I do want to kind of get to it later, talking about perhaps next year. And you mentioned transfer portal stuff. You mentioned it coming in thinking it was going to be a rebuilding year. Turned out it was more so a building year, where you're building yourself as a contender within the Big 12. And showcasing to not only just your fans and the players that are currently in the program, but to players that are outside the program, players that are in high school, that like, this team can be very, very legit and be a threat to win a Big 12 championship and to, maybe make some noise in the college football playoff, which is pretty like incredible to say in year two. And if Joe was on this podcast, I'm sure he'd have crazy stats of it took Utah 1,000 days to get to double digit wins and make it, to get to double digit wins as a Power 4, Power 5 school at the time, school. And it took BYU, in their second year. And again, was in the Big 12 conference championship race until 10 p.m. Mountain Time on the final Saturday of the year. So pretty incredible stuff. I think obviously it's a resounding success of a season, despite the obvious shortcomings there at the end. Jake Retzlaff, I think, blew everyone's expectations out of the water, as just did the team in general. BYU had 3 kickoff returns for touchdowns, which we came into the year being like, can we get our first in 10 years? And then Keelan Marion's like, I will get you 2. And, was it Crew Wakely? He was like, I will also get you 1. Right. And all these things that were happening that we didn't ever really think possible. To think back to like week 1, where we were talking about Jay Hill having a heart attack and coaching through it. And that seems like it was maybe 5 years ago that we were first talking about that
until you mentioned it just now.
I literally
remember that? Remember that happened?
It feels like it's taken about 50 off of my life. Like you kind of talked about earlier, Hunter, just like week in and week out. Like, honestly, like, one of the more relatable things I think you've ever said on this show. And I think as an analogy, like, it felt like every week, like, we were in a car and you're going to like go over like a train track, and the car just like dies on the track with an oncoming train. And for the first 9 weeks, the car turned back on just in time for you to like kind of like ease your way off. And then like the last 3 weeks, it's like the car didn't start. You know what I mean? Like, just like kind of that crushing, like, I don't know. The season was just, it was so much fun, but it was like, it was wild.
And like, you could make the case too, and I think it's a pretty easy case to make, that the best win of the Kalani Sitake era came this year, the road win at SMU. I mean, it's a top 10 team, 1 loss. That 1 loss is to you. It was on the road, and you held them out of the end zone for the entirety of the 60 minutes. like I trying to like wrap my head around of like what would be the second best win. Obviously, BYU fans are going to say, Utah wins are obviously always bigger. 2021 Utah, maybe. The Wisconsin upset, I think, in what was it, 2018 with Kalani.
But none of those teams panned out like SMU has. Though.
Right.
That's the thing is BYU's had big wins and higher ranked wins, like Baylor in 2021 or in 2022. But a lot of those big wins that BYU has, that team ends up going on to kind of stumble throughout the year. Mm-hmm. SMU might be the biggest and best example of BYU beating them and them going on to have the most incredible year that everyone kind of expected that they were going to have. We said before the year, like SMU might be the hardest game on the schedule for BYU. They are one of the favorites to win the ACC. Some fans were like, that's crazy. Ended up being exactly the case. I think it was the best team that BYU faced all year. I think it's the best team BYU's beaten under Kalani Sitake. If you did the blind resume test and took away the logos on the helmets and said 2021 Utah, which obviously they ended up going to the Rose Bowl and winning the Pac-12. But I would say that this SMU win, with it being on the road, with what SMU has gone on to do, is a better win than that. Mm-hmm. And if we're comparing in a vacuum and taking like the rivalry aspect out of it.
Absolutely. And I mean, to pair that along with the kind of quietly good win, I think Joe mentioned this in our group chat, that like the Baylor win might be one of the better ones in recent years as well. Like Baylor finished the season really hot and we beat them. It wasn't like a handy win, but like beat them at home there in Waco. They won almost the rest of their games from there. Like they kind of like they were collapsing and then again got stronger as the season went on. Obviously embarrassed a top 13 Kansas State team in the country at home to the tune of 38-9. Like some other big wins along with that, but I do think SMU is quietly probably the best win of those.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I think in a vacuum, if you're just comparing resumes, and I think Trevor's point earlier is an interesting one, and I'll talk about it in a second. If you're comparing just in a vacuum, I'm not going to tell you what order of wins happened, but here are the teams BYU beat. Here were the scores that they beat them. If I were to tell you, you beat a top 15 Kansas State team at home 38-9. Mm-hmm. If I told you you beat a ACC championship caliber, potentially a ACC champion and playoff team, SMU on the road, and they didn't score a touchdown on you. If you went on the road and beat your rival Utah, that was the Big 12 preseason favorite to win the conference and go to the playoff. If you went on the road and beat Baylor, if you beat Oklahoma State on a last second touchdown, like all these things in a vacuum, you're like, yeah, that's one of like the best seasons in, BYU history, especially in maybe the last 20 years. But it is the fact that you start 9-0 and you lose 2 of your last 3, as opposed to like 2006, where you lose 2 of your first 3. Like BYU 2006, and I think they did it again in 2007. They started 1-2. And then you start Mountain West Conference play and you end up winning all the rest of your games. You end up beating Utah. And like those 2006, 2007, 2009 teams are viewed as like some of the best BYU football teams since the turn of the century. And this BYU team pretty much did exactly that, but against way better competition. They just happened to do it the opposite, where instead of winning your last 9, you won your first 9 and then ended up falling kind of at the end. But it's an interesting discussion that, where this BYU football team, and again, it's really early, but I want to have this conversation before the bowl game. And I'm sure we'll have it again next week and probably for the next few weeks and over the course of the offseason. But where this BYU football team ranks all time BYU football teams. And I want to do it before the bowl game, because nowadays bowl games are meaningless and it's dumb. And we'll give our bowl game kind of predictions, or at least what we would like to see from the bowl game, a little bit later. But before the bowl game, where they end up playing a meaningless game, where does this BYU football team rank among the pantheon of great BYU football teams? Is it a top 3, top 5, probably certainly a top 10, but kind of your thoughts?
I'd say top 5. Obviously no one's topping 1984.
Seems like 84 and 96 are probably the 2.
Yeah. And then
safest 1, 2.
And that's why I can't go top 3 either, because you brought up 06, 07.
You also have 90. You have 94 Detmer Heisman.
96.
You
Yeah, that's
have
a good one.
96. You have 83 Steve Young. 2001, they were like 13-1 with Doman.
I think this season
2020,
this
2021.
this season is better than 2020's.
Okay.
Just because you've eliminated the scheduling question, right?
Yep.
Like you have the pedigree to back up whether or not this like team's like legit or not.
You don't necessarily have the same players, right? Like 2020, you had Tyler Algier, you had Zach Wilson, you had
which I think makes it like
and Isaac
almost,
Rex.
Yeah, almost more impressive. Like it's like we're talking greatest teams of all time. Like then I think you're definitely better than 2020 because top to bottom, consistency wise, like depth wise, this team's better than 2020.
But yeah, we're not talking players. We're obviously talking accomplishments, which I agree wholeheartedly. Like this was a better season in terms of accomplishments than 2020.
And then I think 06, 07, and then like 2024 start to become interchangeable. The thing that's tough for me, and I understand that other people may not have this same kind of measuring stick. Like having like ran in college and different things, I think my mindset on some of these things might just be a little bit different, but it's hard. Like at the end of the year, it's like what did you bring back? Like what did you bring back at the end of the season to hang up or to whatever? And like 2020 or 2006 and 7 have Mountain West titles, right? Like sure, the players probably aren't as good, the schedule wasn't as good, but for what they had and what they went up against, like they won the whole thing. Like there's hardware in the student athlete building indicating like trophies, right? Like you have like proof of these successes. Whereas 2024, like unless you win the bowl game, there isn't anything, right? Like we're none of us are printing regular season co-champs or whatever Ute fans were crying about last weekend or whatever from what Jerem Jordan said, which was completely innocent, but I digress. And so like that's what's tough for me. And I think that's like one of the most heartbreaking things is it just feels like this team should have brought something back and they're not even going to have a chance to outside of the bowl game itself.
Yeah, thinking about it in terms of, I have a hard time placing them and, like saying that, especially over different eras, like obviously the national championship, that's not going to be beat until BYU in 2025. But it's hard for me to place them specifically like, oh, this is top 5 or, bumping like 06 or 07 out for this type of season. It's easier for me to kind of think of it in tiers where like, obviously you have like your S tier, your top tier are the seasons in which like you win the national championship or you win the Sugar Bowl or like things like that. And so I think BYU say that we win the conference championship game and go to the playoff, that would be in that very top tier type of season. And unfortunately, the last 3 games of the season have kind of knocked this down just below it, which is still a great result, something that I absolutely would have been thrilled with at the start of the year. But I think it would have to be kind of in that second tier of seasons, which is not a bad thing at all. But I'd probably put it along with the 06, 07, those types of seasons.
I think I'm going to agree with Trevor in the sense that it's top 5. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm going to put it firmly at number 5. I think obviously is 84 is number 1. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say 96 is number 2. I'm going to say number 3 is the 1990 season. That was, they went, I think they lost 2 regular season games. They lost 3 total games, 10-3. One of those was a bowl game, and one of those was the last game of the year against Hawaii. But you beat number 1 Miami at home, and Ty Detmer won the Heisman. Like that's beating the number 1 team in your stadium and your quarterback winning the Heisman are like 2 things that I think cement you as the number 3 season in BYU history. And then I think it's an interesting discussion. I think there's probably 4 or 5 years that could maybe make a case for this number 5 spot or for the number 4 and 5 spot. I think 83, I think 06, 07, I think 2001, I think 2021, I think 2020, And then I think 2024, kind of like all those teams that maybe are in the discussion here. I want to lean 83 at that 4 spot because you lost your first game by 4 points on the road against Baylor in your first game of the year, and then you won the rest of your games. Steve Young, was a borderline kind of strong Heisman contender there that year. You beat Utah like 55-7.
Number one right there.
And again, like you lost your first, and to Trevor's point, like it's kind of all about, you can maybe lose at the start of the year, but no BYU team is, except for 84 really, has probably finished a year as strongly as that BYU team did. Losing your first game and then winning every single game from that point on. I guess maybe 96 did something similar, but so I'm going to lean 83 at the 4 spot, and then I'm going to put BYU 2024 at the 5, just because BYU has 2 seasons in school history in which their strength of schedule ranking, according to College Football Reference, was above a 1.0. 2 years where they had that tough of a schedule and had double-digit wins. One was 1990 when you beat Miami, which obviously helps with strength of schedule, and then this year. This is, I think, and actually the hardest strength of schedule at a 1.54 that BYU has ever had a double-digit win season. So of all the years that BYU has played football, and it's obviously, over 150 years or whatever it is, or 100 years, this year they had the most wins against the toughest competition that they have in program history, which I think that alone is top 5 season. And it's pretty incredible to think back on all the great years BYU's had, all the wins that they've had. They've had near perfect seasons. They've had perfect seasons. They've had a ton of double-digit win seasons. It's kind of crazy to think that this is the first year Iowa State has ever had a double-digit win season, because it seems like that's almost the expectation for BYU, or at least it was for the longest time, especially coming out of the 80s and 90s and kind of, at the beginning of the 21st century, was like BYU wins double-digit games. And the fact that they've never done that against tougher opponents than they did in 2024, I think speaks volumes to just how good this team is. And it's even crazier when you think of, there's not really like a ton of superstars on this team. When you think about how good of teams were, I mean, think about the 5 that I mentioned, right? 84. I think 84 is almost the most similar to this team, where it's like, yeah, you had Bosco at quarterback, but like Bosco wasn't McMahon, Young, Detmer, or any of those guys. He's a great quarterback. Like, you had a lot of kind of NFL guys along the lines, and there were some dudes, but like I can't think of like maybe like star caliber players on the 84 team, which almost makes them that much cooler. But then you think of like 96 Steve Sarkisian, right, and Chad Lewis and all those guys. 1990, obviously you had Detmer. 06, you had Beck, Brown, Harleen. 2007, 2009, you had Unga, Hall, Colley, Pitta.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, that's
83, you had Steve Young, like the early 80s teams. You had McMahon. 2020, you had Zach Wilson and Tyler Algier. 2021, you had Tyler Algier and Jaron Hall. Puka was on that team too.
Yeah.
Like, each team kind of had star guys, with maybe the exception of 84 and 24, which is a testament to just, again, how good this team is, that they did it without necessarily like, these are your NFL guys. I think if you look at the roster, there's maybe 1 or 2 guys that you're like, yeah, that guy is an NFL caliber guy. I think Jack Kelly is probably the most NFL caliber on this BYU team. I think Jacob Robinson will get looks, and I think Darius Laster gets looks in terms of like the guys that right now are the most NFL, are going to get the most NFL looks. So it's crazy that perhaps their most accomplished season, in the sense of beating the best teams and beating so many of them, was without a Max Hall, without a John Beck, without a Steve Young, without a Jim McMahon, without a Harvey Unga, without an Austin Colley, without a Dennis Pitta, right? And that's just like the offensive guys. So pretty incredible.
And I think, not to, we'll obviously have like off-season expectations episode or whatever. But I think
Mhm.
the thing that is exciting about this year, obviously the record. Chandler, you brought up expectations. One thing that's nice, I think, about how this season ended, if it had to end this way, is the fact that this was clearly a very motivated team from the beginning to prove a lot of people wrong. And they haven't done anything, or I should say I say this without sounding as backhanded as it's going to sound. You guys are going to know what I mean in a second. But like they didn't
It's going to sound worse than it is.
Yes, exactly. Like they didn't accomplish anything to stifle that motivation. Like they didn't like make the conference championship game. Like they didn't make the playoff. Like, yeah, they exceeded expectations, but as far as like things that we heard from the locker room, things that, Kalani's expectations for the team, like close, but like not quite there yet. And so this is a team that has some seniors leaving, has some guys whose decisions are, currently we're waiting on Chase Roberts and, certain guys, but it's not like we're losing a ton of dudes. Like, yeah, like we need our DBs to step up. If Chase does decide to leave, like the wide receiver room, like we need to find our big dog. But like say Chase does come back, like say Trey Alexander is everything that we hoped he is and more, and like Jonathan Cabella steps into his own, or we go to the portal. Like this is a team that has, I would say, budding stars. Like I think with as big of a jump as Jake Retzloff had from last season to this season, being able to build upon that an entire offseason where the first team reps are all his, I think is going to be huge. Returning running backs, like an offensive line that started off great but struggled at the end. Like there's a blueprint there for this team to have the stars of 06 and 07, but with the team chemistry of an 84, which I think is fun. Now, if they capitalize on that, we'll find out when we're having this episode in 365 days. But it is something to at least look forward to and understand that this isn't a team that's going to sit on their hands after this season, because frankly, they're not leaving the season with anything in their hands, if that makes sense. Like like there's just hasn't been much accomplished yet.
It is true. Like you talk about the 83 to 84 transition, and that's not to say that BYU 2025 national champs, although BYU 2025 national champs.
From Chandler's lips to God's ears.
But you look at the guys. You do look at the guys leaving. I mean, Isaiah Banya gone. You probably lose Darius, Caleb Etienne, Connor Pay, Tyler Batty, Blake Mangelson. You basically lose the whole defensive line. You would expect there to be maybe some drop off in the same kind of, not in the exact same sense, but in the same concept of 83. You lose Steve Young, and you think, okay, well, we just went 11-1. We ended the season really strong. We're losing our Heisman contending quarterback, who's going to be the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. The expectations are like, what will the next year's team look like? And because of that building year that was 83, and Chandler mentioned rebuilding year, it was 83 was a building year. I think 2024 is a building year, proving themselves on a national scale. I think BYU can do that again with the guys that are returning. And I think you left meat on the bone in 2024. You got a lot done. You ate a lot of it. But there's still meat on that bone, and there's still a big.
Such a better way to word that than how I did it, Hunter. I appreciate you so much.
There's still meat on the bone, so you should still be hungry. And the 2024 team that's going to be coming back in 2025 should still be hungry.
Yeah.
Jake Retzloff should still be hungry. Keelan Marion, fantastic season. 2 return touchdowns, snubbed as a Big 12 special teams returner of the year. I think he proved himself really valuable in space, kind of almost in a Deebo Samuel type role of like get him involved end around, just get the ball in his hands and in space, and he can make plays happen. JoJo Phillips, fantastic year. He's got to be, maybe in the back of his mind thinking, man, I was 12 inches away from getting a game-winning touchdown catch against Arizona State that would have sent us to the conference championship game. LJ Martin, he's got to be hungry. A lot of the guys on the defense, right? So I do think it is an interesting concept. And does a guy like Chase Roberts, who could come back next year, think, hey, I also was probably snubbed in Big 12 awards? He has been, fantastic chemistry with Jake Retzloff. He was the go-to guy in any gotta-have-it situation. You think about the 4th down against Kansas, targeted Chase Roberts. Hail Mary against Arizona State, targeted Chase Roberts. On key 4th down and 3rd down conversions throughout the year, Jake always looked at Chase Roberts. They've got great chemistry. Does Chase think there's still meat left on that bone, both from a team perspective and a personal perspective? I want to come back in 2025. We'll see. But I do think that is, good news. And obviously, again, Jake, right? He just quarterbacked BYU to what, I and Trevor and Chandler all thought was one of the best seasons in BYU football history, and came up just short. Football bouncing off a helmet away, or a Hail Mary 1 yard short away, or a foot over JoJo Phillips's head away from being in the conference championship and potentially being in the college football playoff. So it'll be interesting to see who does decide they want to come back and run it back, and hopefully that they can build on this year. And through the portal, we saw some guys enter the portal. I didn't see a single guy that entered his name into the portal that I thought that's going to hurt from a production standpoint next year. And I think there's going to be a lot of guys who are going to go into the portal and look at BYU as a team that they want to come play for.
Absolutely. And just to build on your point there, Hunter, I remember this same episode about last year, and talking about which guys were leaving, and we were sad that both Eddie Heckard and Camden Garrett were done, right? We talked about that being one of the best DB rooms that BYU has ever had. And so the question, of course, was are we going to reload? Is it going to be the same group? Is that going to be a liability next year? And then BYU this year famously has tied for most interceptions in all of college football, 20. So it just kind of goes to show that we should trust our coaching staff maybe a bit more than we have on both sides of the ball. Even in areas where I am concerned, a little bit about the D-line depth next year, or about the cornerback room as it stands right now. That was our same question we had last year, and we tied for the most interceptions in all of college football this year with 20. So pretty remarkable job. And like you said, still plenty of meat on the bone. The guys should still be pretty hungry there next year, but still a lot to be excited about. And it's fun going into this next season with a lot more expectations.
And even in those positions where you have the biggest question marks, I think right now, biggest question mark for sure is defensive line. Just because, like you said, all those guys are gone. But you also have Ephraim Asiata and some young guys who can step into larger roles. Cornerback, you're going to lose Mark Collins. You're going to lose
Jacob
Robinson. I think Mo Bamba, they said your eligibility's up, but he's appealing and trying to get another year. But even if he's gone too, you've got young players like Trey Alexander and Jonathan Cabea, who
Evan Johnson
really
was good at times.
Evan Johnson was solid at times. Safety, you got that kid from Bountiful. I forget his name.
Satwala.
Yeah, who's coming up. He had, good moments his freshman year. So there's a lot of youth, I think, in key positions that BYU is going to really need to have developed this offseason. But again, I think we've got the coaches to do it. Jay Hill's done a great job. It doesn't sound like he's going to be going to Logan and Utah State. I know it was reported he was a finalist. Sounds like Utah State's going to be hiring a different BYU coach. Well,
thank you,
BYU
Bronco.
Coach. But it should be a good building season, and hopefully a springboard season in 2024 that can launch BYU into contention for the next several years within the Big 12. But the 2024 season's not over. We still have a bowl game. We said before the year, all we want to do is get to a bowl game. These are our bowl game predictions, or I guess we should say what we want to happen for a bowl game. I don't know if it's necessarily a prediction. Brought to you by Charlie Hustle, sponsor of the podcast, sponsor of the 1012 Podcast Network. Make sure you go to charliehustle.com. Holidays are around the corner. You can get BYU sweatshirts, BYU shirts. If you're a fan of one of the other Big 12 teams and you're just listening to maybe get a scouting report on BYU, you can go to Charlie Hustle and use the code 10 12 15. That's TEN, the number 12, the number 15 for 15% off your order.
Nice.
What do we think bowl game wise? Seems like the common projection is BYU, Colorado, Alamo Bowl. I hate that more than I hate anything that's happened this year. But what are your guys' thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just to kick it off. Like, you can't say how much I would hate that. One, Colorado looks like pretty good. They ended the season on a really high note. It's just the early losses that kind of killed them, and that's why they're out of the college football playoff discussion and also the conference championship game. But it's very possible that they're the best team in the Big 12, like at the moment, like the hottest team. And so I definitely wouldn't want to play another conference opponent, especially a conference opponent that has finished the year as strong as they have, and essentially a third place game for the Big 12. Like, it would just, it would feel kind of meaningless. Like, playing a third or fourth place game. And, like, I don't know why, as a senior or somebody who is like draft eligible, who was debating leaving, why you'd want to play in that, except for just to play one more game with your friends and with your teammates. So that would be kind of like the nightmare scenario. The dream scenario, and the one that I keep thinking of, would be getting awarded like a spot in the Pop-Tart Bowl there in Orlando against either Clemson or Miami, another like top-ranked ACC team. It'd be incredible for BYU to have the chance to beat both the potential ACC champion in SMU and the second place team in Clemson potentially in the same season.
No doubt. Yeah.
That'd be incredible for the conference to say, hey, like, our third place team beat both your champion and your runner up in the span of 3 months.
Yeah.
And when it comes to all of the college football playoff discussions and strength of conference and all that, like, leave no doubt that the Big 12 is not fourth, at least in terms of conference strength.
Yeah, the Colorado game, I think one of my biggest hangups with that entire thing is, especially towards the end of the season, we've heard from Nick Saban, we've heard from Lane Kiffin, we've heard from like all these SEC guys, and frankly, what should be non-affiliated media members who, for whatever reason, have just tied themselves to SEC everything. That, which sucks so bad. I love Pat, but
he's a Big 12 guy too. I don't know what gives.
I know. Well, we'll move on. But like
he just panders to whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He like, let us play somebody else. Like, if you want to use all these hypothetical games, and then when the opportunity allows for you to actually play a team on the field and like settle it, like, let that happen. Like, no one benefits from two Big 12 teams playing each other. Like, it's lazy, and it's just not. I would like to believe that the Pop-Tart Bowl and the Alamo Bowl are probably looking to avoid that as well, because that in itself, I don't think drives money like a BYU versus Miami or a BYU versus Clemson, or even Colorado against insert whoever their opponent would be there. So I would like to think, with them being the ones that ultimately send out the invitations, that's probably something that we're avoiding. But I'd prefer Clemson, would be my top choice for sure. I voiced this on Twitter as well. Just my concern with Miami is that if they get the Pop-Tart Bowl or the Valero Bowl against, I guess it'd just be the Pop-Tart Bowl against BYU, that Cam Ward sits out, that, other guys, they just have a bunch of opt-outs. Whereas I think Clemson, between Dabo Sweeney, just kind of who he is, as well as like Cade Klubnik being like a freshman, like, it just feels like a game where you're not going to see as many opt-outs from Clemson as you would like just a mass exodus with Miami. And so if I got to pick, I want a game that would be, now Miami could very well be competitive still. I'm not saying if they all opt out, we win easily, but as far as like first team versus first team goes, I think Clemson's your best look at that. So that would be my choice, would be the Pop-Tart Bowl against Clemson.
We're not hearing you, Hunter. Let's see. I think
I muted my mic.
There you go.
Bowl games are meaningless anyway. I think making it essentially just another conference game and two teams that are going to play each other next season is extra meaningless. I don't even want to not play Colorado because they're good, which like they are good.
Sure, yeah.
But like it's gonna more so like I would be fine playing Clemson or Miami, which I think are as good or even better, right? Like it's not the I think we'd lose or we could lose aspect. It's more so it'd be a Sanders Hunter love fest.
Yeah.
BYU would get absolutely zero attention. No one would talk about them. It would be just a absolute Colorado love
until they
fest.
won.
Even when they won, they'd probably still be talking about, this was
No,
Sanders and Travis Hunter's last game. You know, they left it all out on the field. Like the entire game, all they'd talk about is Dion, Shadur, and Travis. Before the game, all they would talk about is Dion, Shadur, and Travis. Like, I just don't want that. And again, I don't want to play a team that is in our own conference. And to your point, Trevor, too, this should be the last thing. Like Brett, I mean, it has to be two Big 12 teams, but like as a commissioner, you should be fighting that as much as you can. Like make it Colorado, Iowa State or something like that, right? Or send Colorado to the Pop-Tart Bowl to play Miami. That would get a lot of eyeballs, right?
Yep.
Like a Clemson, Colorado, or a Miami, Colorado. But yeah, if I could pick, I would say give me Miami versus BYU in the Pop-Tart Bowl. Give me the rematch in 1990, in Florida. BYU versus Cam Ward would be awesome. Two teams that were kind of in the playoff discussion all year long too would be really fun. Like it'd almost be like it wouldn't have anything at stake, but it'd almost be a playoff matchup. And like these two teams were in the lead in their conference all season long. They stumbled kind of at the end, but like these were two playoff caliber teams for the duration of 12 games. I think would be really, really cool. So give me that if I could pick. Unfortunately, it does sound like it's most likely going to be BYU Colorado in the Alamo Bowl, but if we can do whatever we can do vibes wise to put it out into the universe to be like, we do not want BYU Colorado. Because again, like BYU plays Colorado next season. You're just getting a preview of the conference matchup is incredibly lame. And for BYU, it almost feel, it wouldn't be the same degree as this, but it almost feel the same way of like 2021, where it's like an awesome season. Then you get to the end and you're like, okay, you're going to Shreveport to play UAB. Like BYU has this awesome season. They go 10-2 and it's like, okay, you're going to just play another Big 12 team in essentially like what you said, the conference third place game, which is really dumb, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Just putting this out there for the powers that be. I know they're listening. So I pledge to buy so many Pop-Tarts. I will post pictures on Twitter. I'll get a few different flavors. I'll get the new flavor that they're bringing back. Like all of us will, right?
I will record a month's worth of podcast episodes in a Pop-Tarts costume should BYU go to the Pop-Tarts Bowl.
I'd eat one on episode. I'd eat one on episode for the next couple of weeks.
Every episode of the off season, Trevor has to eat a Pop-Tart.
Yeah, I love that.
Gentlemen, we're over the hour mark, but any parting thoughts? We'll, I'm sure, dive more into the bowl game once it's announced. I think when this weekend. We got conference championship games this Saturday, and then bowl game schedules announced Sunday.
Yeah, as far as I understand, yeah.
Next week will essentially be a full-on bowl game preview. It's as soon as that's over, we got the Hypey Award season. And then it's basketball. We're full in on basketball after the Hypey Awards. So the excitement and the hype doesn't die down just because the BYU regular season is over. So make sure if you haven't subscribed, send it to a friend. We did our Spotify Wrapped this year. We saw 6% increase in like downloads and listens. We launched the YouTube channel in 2024, which has gotten a lot of subscribers and a lot of views. Like over 100 people had us in their top 5 most listened to shows on Spotify, which is incredibly awesome. So we thank you. But yeah, send it. We want to get more people and we want to grow even more in 2025. So send it to a friend, like, subscribe, share it. And if you aren't already, go subscribe to the YouTube as well. So gentlemen, thank you as always. And it's Go Cougs and Cougs by a Billion every week.